I'd like to start with a couple of thank yous today. I'd like to thank the Dunlop for hosting this show. I'd like to thank Blair for seeking me out a couple of years ago to start talking about the show. And I'd like to thank her for not flinching too much when I told her that there wasn't going to be any prints in the printmaking professor's show at the Dunlop here. I don't think any of you have seen the show. I don't think the doors are open yet, and some of you may have got a sneak peek of this work in my studio over the last little while. But no one, including me, had seen it up on the walls the way it really needed to be seen until a couple of days ago when I installed it. So I'd like to thank the Dunlop and Blair. I'd also like to thank Eric and Glenn who helped me install the work the other day. It all went pretty smoothly, but they were forced to do a lot of heavy lifting for a few minutes at a time here and there while I hummed and hawed and then screwed things to the wall. I'd like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board publicly, and I mean this isn't just a platitude. They gave me a great deal of support in order to kind of figure out this show and make this work over the last couple of years, so I'd like to thank the Sask Arts Board for that. I'd like to thank the University of Regina because they let me work in their well-heated, well-lit space and use their electricity and generally give me things like sabbaticals and time off here and there to work on my work, so I'd like to thank the U of R for that. And I'd like to thank my family. I'd like to thank my partner Sarah, who's at the back there, who really helped hold the fort down literally while she gets her own art career back up and running, looking after our 3 little ones who incidentally are not here. So I'd like to thank my friends who are looking after my children, screaming and yelling right now, wondering why this is so boring and flopping around and that sort of thing. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. I really appreciate it. It's a weird little spot up here on Rochdale, and I don't spend much time up here, although I had the best spring rolls I've ever had in Regina at a place called Mekong, which is like across the street. So you should go there sometime, because for real, it was delicious. And everybody who's talked to me in the last few days has heard me talk about these bloody spring rolls. They're really good. And I'd like to give one final shout out to Christian Huygens, who in 1722 wrote a book called The Celestial Worlds Discovered, Conjectures on the Inhabitants, Plants, and Productions of the Worlds and the Planets. This is a book that I read this summer, and you'll see that a lot of kind of astronomical physics and science kind of stuff is influencing me in my work lately. And Christian Huygens wrote this book, and he wrote this book at a time when science and art were things that were still kind of coming together in terms of figuring out what exactly goes on out in the world and out in the dark space beyond this lovely little surface that we live on here on the Earth. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to the Conversationalist. Kind of going back to the Sask Arts Board, the project that I wrote for the Sask Arts Board a couple of years ago called Skywriting. And you know, it was a big, long kind of thing, but the general gist was that I was suggesting that light and wood and text, or text and words, are a conceptual site for communication. And my work has been caught up with the notion of communication for about as long as I can remember, and as I continue to go back in time, you know, revisiting what I've done and where I've been, communication, the way in which communication works and doesn't work, has been really central to what it is that I do as an artist. So I situate myself along the continuum of those that would attempt to harness or wrestle with words, tapping into the fundamental need, that I believe all human beings have, which is to communicate. So I have been thinking about communication as a thing for quite a long time, and communication, I think, is kind of a funny thing because inherently communication is unreliable, it's fallible. Even as a concept, I think it's really problematic. And the practice of communication, the practice of attempting to communicate is even more fraught. So it occurred to me that aside from going back to like my books written by Marshall McLuhan, 50 or 60 years ago, to talk about communication, I went onto the interweb and I looked up some definitions for what information or what communication is. And I apologize, really I'd like to be in the space so I can like point at stuff. And so I've kept this very, very, very sparse. So I've got 6 slides altogether. So just kind of bear with me. Communication, according to all of the things online, is the imparting or exchanging of information or news. The successful conveying or sharing of ideas and feelings. meh, or social contact, maybe the more interesting two-word definition of communication. And then I wanted to know what information was, because I think I know what information is, but the problem is, and you'll get this from me later, that the more questions you ask, the more you realize you don't know anything. And so, and I'm not just saying that to position myself along the great philosophers of the world who, you know, like, were so humble by saying they didn't know anything, where everyone was like, yeah, but he knows a lot. That's not where I was going with that at all. Information are facts provided or learned about something or someone. So my first slide here is of the uncertainty principle, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit as I go here. But you haven't seen the work upstairs, so really let me just kind of quickly describe it to you. They're light boxes. There are no prints in this show. They're made out of wood. This is wood that I haven't quite hewn it from a standing tree, but it's wood that I have manipulated into light boxes. The light boxes are letters. They're about 2 feet tall, and they form phrases. The most recent of the phrases, and the one that I'm going to talk about right now, is this mathematical equation here called the uncertainty principle. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I came to this particular symbol, and it's going to take up the bulk of the kind of the time I think that I'm kind of allotted for myself here. So I'll go back to looking at my early life and at my work, and religion and a Catholic upbringing is central. I was raised a Catholic. I've had family members in this country since the 1600s, all God-fearing, capital F-fearing folks, mostly in Quebec, and I'm part of that. I'm part of that lineage, and so I went to school, grade school and high school, Catholic schools. I had to wear a uniform. I didn't wear it very well. In fact, I wore it quite well because I rarely wore it. And but I was forced into wearing a uniform, and I went to church every week. And I had First Communion when I was a little kid, and I ate up Jesus' body. And I had confirmation, which, you know, at the age of 12, I made a public statement that I was sure that I knew what I was doing as a young adult. But really, you know, what manifested itself in my life around my relationship to religion and that sort of thing was a rebelliousness, which I think is pretty common. And later on, a sense of kind of an aggressiveness even against or about my religion as I grew up. You know, going to school, going to church, wearing uniforms and that sort of thing. And so early on, even from the very first sketchbook that I ever got from my cousin, she was much older than me, she gave me a sketchbook, and I drew like, I was like 10 years old, and I drew, you know, flowers and Lego and stuff in the front. But on the back page of the sketchbook, I'd drawn a crucifix, and like a Christ up on the cross crucifix, and I kept it in the back page. And I would look at it, and it made me feel kind of weird and uneasy, and I wasn't exactly sure why, but so from a very early age, and before I even had any artistic training, I was wrestling with some of those fundamental questions that I had. And so as I got older and I went off to university, I realized that I could use the F word, and I could use all kinds of other terrible words, and I could make pictures that were really aggressive about my religious upbringing, and I could really push back in a way that was, you know, I think typical of I'm not going to get overly heteronormative here on you, but like 19, 20-year-old boys away from school drinking beer 6 days a week, making art on the side, or, you know, essentially, I suppose. But I was really kind of pushing back in a lot of ways against my upbringing, which was not terrible. You know, I wasn't treated poorly, but you know, anytime you have a thing imposed upon you, I think that gives you some fodder. And so my work, you know, for years and years and years referenced religion, sometimes more explicitly than others, sometimes really aggressively, and other times much more subtly. And I think that probably in about the last 8 years or so, probably around, since about the time that I've come to Regina, I don't think that having children has softened me necessarily, but I do think that there was a degree of softness in terms of my relationship to religion that has come up. And rather than kind of attribute that to growth or anything like that, I would more realistically attribute it to a relationship that I have with my grandmother, who has been dead for 15 years. My grandma Fleur. She was a lovely woman, and I was the oldest child of her youngest child. I lived in the city that she lived in, and I spent a lot of time with her. And she was a product of her upbringing. She was a devout Catholic, and every day for the 10 years between the day that my grandfather died and that she died, she said this one particular prayer of serenity every single day. She believed in the afterlife. She believed in a guy in a robe with a beard who was benevolent most of the time, looking down on us, maybe keeping an eye on us, but then also maybe ready to kind of smite us down if the opportunity arose. And really in this last kind of 8 or so years, I've thought a lot about my relationship with my grandmother, and if I was to stick her into the same category, or the category that I think, or I thought, maybe I'll say thought, because then that don't seem quite as awful, but that I thought devoutly religious people fall into, then how could I reconcile that with my absolute adoration of her? And so I've attempted to instead give her a break and give religion a little bit of a break as well. So what does that all mean? Well, so I'm going to fast forward ahead to my introduction, or my reintroduction, or my reacquaintance with Carl Sagan. It's excellent timing for Risa Horowitz to arrive here as I talk about Carl Sagan. So for those of you who don't know who Carl Sagan is, Carl Sagan was a physicist, or an astrophysicist, a cosmologist, and also a wonderful advocate of science all through his career up until when he died, I think right in the mid-90s. And I'd always known about Carl Sagan, and I was reintroduced to him because I was on the web. I was looking on the web one time. I was on Tumblr or something, and I saw this little quick GIF, and it was Carl Sagan, and he was talking about books. And he said something about books being this really special thing, and I thought, well, I love Carl Sagan, and I love books, and so I should seek this out a little bit further. And so I found out where the quote had come from, and it had come from his Cosmos series, which has been reduxed by Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple of years ago. And if you've never seen Cosmos by Carl Sagan, it's online, and you should definitely spend some time because it's incredible. It's absolutely wonderful. The wonder and joy that this man attempted to bring to the world as it relates to knowing things is really it's really catchy, I would say. And so what Carl Sagan had said in this quote that had been really kind of chopped down to make it into a 3-second mini animation was this. He said, "What an astonishing thing a book is. It's a flat object made from a tree with flexible parts on which are imprinted lots of funny dark squiggles. But one glance at it and you're inside the mind of another person, maybe somebody dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, an author is speaking clearly and silently right inside of your head, directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people who never knew each other, citizens of distant epochs. Books break the shackles of time, and book is a proof that a book is proof that humans are capable of working magic." And it gives me tingles when I think about this. And so again, that led me to watching the Cosmos series. And forgive me if this seems a little kind of like chopped up, because that's how it all kind of happens in my head here. So I watched this Cosmos series, and then I started thinking about the sky a little bit more, and it may be the proximity to my colleague Risa down the hall, who's looking at the sky often as well. But I started to look at the sky a lot more than I had in the past. And Terence Dickinson, who's a kind of well-known Canadian astronomy kind of dude, and I'm paraphrasing here, has said something to the tune of, to take up astronomy is the most humbling thing that one can do. And he may have paraphrased that from Carl Sagan, because Carl said something like that as well. But it can't just be the Rob and Carl show here. So looking up at the sky and what that implies, to me, having grown up as a Catholic, it implies potentially shame. It implies ignorance. It implies a proneness. But to me, it's very much about religion and about not knowing. I've always felt like, if you see a tourist looking around like this in the city, they don't know what they're doing, and they're a bumpkin, and they're not in the know, and they're ripe to be ripped off or knocked over or something. And so I've never wanted to look up at the sky very, very much. I kind of glance up and I'm quick about it. I don't want anyone to see it. And I mean this absolutely sincerely. And the project that I pitched to the Sask Arts Board that generated this show, among other things, was called Skywriting. So that is the looking up thing. That is the connection. And so the connection to my grandmother really is and religion is this, that religion and science, although at very opposite ends in some ways, are very, very similar. They ask very, very similar fundamental questions. And I've managed to kind of circle back around on asking the kind of questions that I think I was asking or pushing against with religion early on. But the problem, as I say before, with asking a lot of questions is that the answers only bring exponentially more questions if you really want to know. And I really want to know. But then that means there's more admission of guilt, there's more ignorance, there's more shame, there's more humility, there's more fear, and maybe more hopelessness when you don't know. There's more than you could possibly know. And I've written down here, yikes, because that's kind of heavy. You want to know more and you want to know more, and then eventually you maybe come to this conclusion that there's too much to know, and that maybe one day, and this thing is also just mind-blowing to me, we human beings, the Earth, the solar system, one day we're going to be gone and forgotten. And that can be a thing that can really stall you, I think, in your tracks. What's the point? You can dive into this real whole hopelessness. What is our responsibility anyways on Earth as human beings, to one another, to the Earth, to knowledge, to all of those bigger things? If it's, in geological kind of time frames, cosmological time frames, we're nothing. We're gone. We'll be gone and gone and gone, and there will be no one to know that we were ever here. Is it 5 W's? Who, what, when, where, why? Oh yeah, and then there's the how part too. Led me to start thinking again about how much anyone can know about anything. And questions about my size in the universe and our size in the universe and literally the mote of dust that is the Earth in the immense, almost infinite cosmological scales. Beg investigations in both directions in my mind. So the infinite cosmos and the fundamentally smaller and getting smaller things that make up our own selves, our own body, and everything around us. Carl, too, hinted at this line of inquiry when he said that we are all made of star stuff. So I'm not going to go into what that means. But what we are made of didn't come from any kind of big bang. We came from stars that blew up. It's the only way that most of the stuff that makes us up could exist. Like literally. So that brings me my reacquaintance with Carl and my kind of imagining my relationship with spirituality and science and in some ways religion and in some ways kind of rational thought. Brought me to my sabbatical summer a couple of summers ago. So I was drywalling the attic in my boxer shorts and a dust mask, plastic. Lots and lots and lots of dust. And it was the playroom and the kids wanted it finished, so I was up there hustling, and my poor Sarah was downstairs, keeping an eye on 3 kids who all they wanted to do was be up at the plastic looking in to see what was going on. And I was drywalling the attic, and I had been through all my Cosmos series, and I some things about Carl and some of the more scientific books and things that I'd been reading got me thinking, well, I really do want to know what happens at the very smallest scale. So I want to know about atoms, and I want to know about things that are smaller than atoms. And I began to resent, in many ways, my former self, who resisted doing much in the way of science and math when I was in high school, because I wanted to make art, and I wanted to do all the other kinds of things that I wanted to do, and there just wasn't enough time in the day, and there was a lot of holes or gaps in the things that I thought I knew and needed to know in order to talk somewhat intelligently about what I was trying to do as an artist. So I started doing what we all do, which is you get onto the internet, you go onto YouTube, and you start searching for things, and somehow or another I discovered Richard Feynman, who is an absolutely incredible Nobel-winning physicist who in the 50s, along with 2 other guys, reconciled some of the descriptive elements of quantum electrodynamics, the field of science that is the most proven of everything. It's really weird, and it's really kind of counterintuitive in terms of common sense. Things that exist that are smaller than the atom don't behave the way we expect that they ought to behave. But I found Richard Feynman just by accident, and so I wasn't watching him, I was listening to him. I'm sanding the drywall, and it was 45 degrees Celsius up there, and my head's a little spinny, and I was having these kind of I won't say I was having these visions, but I was deeply, deeply affected by listening to these lectures, and it turns out that I just happened upon probably the most famous of his lectures that he gave in New Zealand in the late 70s, and they were all about physics. And so give me 1 second here to digress slightly about YouTube. Now I'm speaking to a bunch of people who all know this already, but YouTube and the internet right now are so incredible because in many ways they parallel, and here's the kind of conceptual link to my original pitch to Sask Arts. It really kind of is an analog to the dawning of the first information age, which is when, in my mind, Gutenberg and people in that kind of vicinity invented the idea of movable type and books, and the vast generation of knowledge that kind of came out of there absolutely changed the world, because we didn't have to start, as human beings, we didn't have to start reinventing knowledge every single generation or two. We could build upon it, and right now we are living in this age. It's hard, and it gets cliche to talk about it because we've been in it for a little while now, but we are living in this age where like everything is available to us, and there's no reason not to know things, which for someone like me is really difficult because I can't sleep at night because I really need to go down and watch and read and learn more, and there's just too much more, and it's just too hard. The why questions I've written here keep on coming. But Richard Feynman, and the reason why I really kind of gravitated towards him is, aside from the fact that what he was explaining to me was really interesting, he as a teacher, he as a communicator, he reached me. He could reach me while I was sanding above my head, you know, really hot, really uncomfortable, 6 hours into like a sanding session, and he could reach me in a way that I think is really important in terms of people who attempt to communicate, and particularly for teachers. And so it's not to say that I align myself with him, but I really think, gosh, if I could reach people in any way like he could, wow, wouldn't that be an amazing gift? Definitely a gift that he gave to people, and a gift that I hope I'm able to give to my students, or to whoever ends up kind of in front of me in a group like this. But Feynman, so here's the picture here. Feynman's first great contribution really in science into the world, and he did all kinds of neat things, like he figured out how the Challenger shuttle exploded in the 80s. Was his contribution to quantum electrodynamics, which is just a kind of a sub-speciality of physics, and this mathematical equation right here is called the uncertainty principle. I'm not going to explain it to you as if I'm a physicist, because I'm not. But what I can tell you is this: I can tell you that the position of a particle times the momentum of a particle is greater than or equal to the reduced Planck constant, that's that h bar, over 2. And what it all means is science can get things down to a certain point, like an almost infinitesimally small point, like 40 decimal places, to prove certain aspects within physics to understand how the world works. But there comes a point, and scientists continue to work on this, they continue to try to push that decimal place further, but there comes a point where they must fundamentally accept that you can only know so much, and as soon as you get to that point, then everything else is explainable. So really what this says is, you can know how fast a particle is moving, but you can't know where exactly it is. Or you can know where it is, but you can't possibly know how fast it's going. And it's this kind of like analogy to faith, or this analogy to kind of belief that that the road of science in many ways has taken to get to a similar kind of position to people who are spiritual, or people who have a kind of a religious belief. That's not to say that I believe that they're equal, but it was a really an aha moment for me when I came to that this attempt to communicate this somewhat elegant bit of writing up on the wall that could fill chalkboards with all kinds of interesting kind of other numbers, and that really tells us that we can only know so much, and we can't know any more. And if we are willing to accept that, then we can know this other stuff. So that's where the uncertainty principle came from. The second image in the show upstairs, and I'm over the bulk of my talking points here. The other two images get a little less time. One of the other images upstairs is of the phrase moral hazard, and this was actually just taken from part of a transparency. You guys can see that, right? I'm not having this. This was taken from Transparency that turned into a silkscreen print that I made a couple of years ago. But I like the kind of repetition of it, so I've used it as my visual here. So moral hazard, what I love about this term is that it sounds, like a religious term. It sounds like an ethical term or something like that, but it's actually a term from economics. And it's a term that I learned or first heard in watching, or rather listening to Frontline on PBS in my studio. So I listen to music, I do, but I often listen to episodes of stuff, and I was listening to Frontline on the global financial meltdown a number of years ago. And so this is what moral hazard actually is the lack of incentive to guard against risk where one is protected from its consequences. So in terms of the global financial meltdown, of which I think many of us have been at least a part of for almost 10 years now, or kind of moving that direction, things around mortgage packaging and subprime mortgages and the collapses of the too big to fail banks and that sort of thing in the United States. But really what it means is that there are people who are in a position to make choices that could benefit them but won't hurt them. The hurt is all put on some other poor sap, usually further down the line, and that person doesn't know that they have assumed all of this risk. And so I listened to this episode, and I listened to, there were several episodes, and it really got me thinking, and I was attempting, as I was working on some other prints, to reconcile moral hazard as an economic term with moral hazard, this kind of this colloquial definition that I generated in my head, which you probably could start to figure out. Moral hazard would be a thing where you shouldn't do a thing because it's going to cause you peril. Well, it's actually kind of the opposite. You do a thing because it's going to cause someone else peril, or not, but it doesn't really hurt you. And the way in which I'm going to jump slightly ahead, so I need to stop myself here. I'll tell you why I like the moral hazard thing in a second, but I'll tell you how it connects to me, because really that's how I see the world. Things kind of focus, or I focus and I zoom in, zoom out of them, on them in my own head, and I look for connections to my own experiences. So my sister, Tanya, lives in Ohio. She's lived there for probably 10 years. She's a horse trainer. She loves her life there, and she was married to a guy named Brian, a really sweet guy. And they lived in a little town, and they were attempting to sell their house. It was a little house in a town called Findlay, Ohio, and there's only so many people who want to move in and out of Findlay, and they were attempting to sell their house at a time when things were just slipping downhill in the United States financially. And I recall they tried to sell their house, and the market was really bad, and my brother-in-law said, "There's no way I'm selling my house for $75,000 when I paid $125,000 for it, and I've put $30,000 into it. There's no way I'm taking that amount of money." And they got an offer that was about $90,000. So better than it could have been, but still he couldn't reconcile himself to that kind of choice. And they turned down the offer, and they never sold the house, and it languished, and then my sister moved to another town to work, and their marriage fell apart, and they're divorced. And that has kind of come home to roost, at least in terms of my family, because I'm the older brother, and I've got 3 siblings, and family dynamics being what they are. And so the notion of moral hazard as this kind of colloquialism, but then the notion of moral hazard as this actual economic phrase, I really fought with it a lot, because my sister's whole life, and she's still recovering, this is several years ago, but she's still really recovering, fell apart because of this phrase, because people somewhere way far away were making choices that caused banks to fall apart, which caused markets to collapse, and it trickled down. So this notion of this gigantic system, which seems unknowable, maybe cosmological in a sense, does trickle down to the end user. And so I saw an interesting kind of analogy between the moral hazard and the way I was seeing physics. But it took me kind of quite a bit of time to kind of come to those connections to myself. What I really liked about the phrase initially, before I started to kind of dive into it, was that it sounds like a philosophical or even an ethical thing. But of course it's more clinical. It is a description, but in a fundamental sense, the term moral hazard fails at its charge. It's confusing, and it is contradictory, and in many ways I think that is what makes it really, really interesting for me. It needs context, or it needs discussion. This is an unrealized maquette for a silkscreen called Lost Cause, but the term Lost Cause exists upstairs also. Lost Cause and moral hazard as phrases that we're going to turn into these light boxes were initially conceived together. They were two pieces. They were going to kind of be pitted against one another, which has always been my kind of MO in terms of making prints. I put images together. It's not to say that I divest myself of responsibility and that you all have to figure out what it means, but I like putting things together and seeing how the dynamic kind of shifts, how it kind of teases itself out. The uncertainty principle as an image came later, and that was really even after meeting with Blair once or twice about the possibility for this show. There was a certain kind of melancholic harmony between the two phrases, moral hazard and lost cause, not the least of which riffed off the key and the delivery of the lyrics of the song of the same name by Beck. I'm not a huge Beck fan, and so in some ways I'm slightly mortified to see reference to Beck and this song and the context of the video and the story and that sort of thing in a bit of the writing about the show. But the song, the Lost Cause, came from a Beck song. That's where it definitely came from. But let me give you the context for this. Somehow this song showed up on my computer at my studio a number of years ago. Probably it was a stowaway on a USB drive from a student who would come in to do a lithoplate or make a silkscreen transparency. But either way, there it was, probably along with like all kinds of like bad essays and whatnot that come off their USB drive as well. And this song was imported into my iTunes playlist, and it made it onto the playlist, and it made onto the playlist a lot. But this was several years ago. So why does that have anything to do with what I'm doing here? Well, personally, I'm really susceptible to repetition as a human being and as an artist. I watch the same television shows, the same movies, the same like web things over and over and over again. My wife will also attest. She's raising her eyebrow at me because I've watched The Big Lebowski like for the last 9 nights in a row, I think every single night. I like it. It's a pretty good movie, but that's not the point. I'm watching it over and over. She goes off to do other things, and I just Netflix myself. But I'm really susceptible to repetition, and so I read a lot, but I also read my favorite books. They cycle back into things. So I read the same books over and over and over again. And if Lacia were here, Lacia Vogel's a grad student of mine, and I've got a whole bunch of students here I'm pleased to see. But if Lacia were here and she's away, she just defended her thesis last week, so she's having a little time away. If she was here, I might bust into some Kierkegaard on the subject of repetition, but I won't. If you want to read a little bit about repetition, Kierkegaard has a lovely quote that Lacia actually used in her exhibition. So the lost cause phrase, just in terms of time, became really closely associated with moral hazard, in terms of time, in terms of being in the studio, and by intellectual proximity, at least in any case. But in the end, I was unable to reconcile those two things together. They seemed too far apart, or just too unrelated, or too much of a diptych where I was giving it all to someone else to figure out. And they needed a third element, which was the uncertainty principle, which I've already talked about, but I really wanted to talk about more centrally because it's, I think, really the focus of where things are going for hazard and lost cause. Which in a way mimics the dynamic shift that can happen when between 2 and 3 voices when they're in a conversation. So, hence, at least partly, the title of the show. And I wish you'd seen the show. You're going to get to see it right after, so it's fine. So just kind of stow this away, but it would make a little more sense, possibly, if you were up there. So this is partly a Venn diagram, it's partly an RGB separation, it's partly the different colors or flavors of quarks. And I'm not sure what the big yellow thing is over there, but it could be a whole bunch of things. And then I made some arrows too, which I thought was nice. I say partly about the title of the show because I'm not entirely convinced that this even makes the slightest amount of sense. To you. It does to me. There's the problem with communication, though. I can only get so much of what I've got in here out to you, and you have to meet me some way, part way. So as I said before about the voices in a conversation, I think in some ways putting these phrases together in the gallery might be more akin to putting 3 people in a room together where none of them speak the same language. Perhaps they all speak a common language, but their actual languages, the ones that they're most comfortable in, they're not speaking. But I'll hedge again and say that I don't know that it's as grave as that either. While I may not think that it's truly possible to communicate with any degree of certainty, I think that as humans knowing this, and knowing that the intention, and this is a word, intention, that all students I've ever had always hear from me, so they always hear me talking about intention. Knowing that the intention is to communicate, is, capital I-S, is the thing that really unites us, and maybe gives us some hope. Thank you.